Okay, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today, but I think it's important not only to conservatism, but to America as well, and it's dealing with racial fatigue. Several months back, there was a Washington Post ABC News poll that said 73% of Americans think that race relations are bad. According to the data, the poll stated that the recent rise in concern about race relations has been primarily driven by white Republicans, some of whom have long been skeptical of seeing racial discrimination as a national problem and are now acknowledging the disharmony. Now, I don't think that's necessarily bad. It's not to say that conservatives don't think that racial discrimination exists. I think most conservatives have been and are very concerned about the increased racial polarization that's dividing the country. But I believe that many conservatives and independents question the degree to which racism still exists. That's to say that the skepticism of many conservatives revolves around the racial claims and credibility of racial grievance instigators and other racial justice warriors when it comes to qualifying racial accusations. I think that's a crucial distinction. Conservatives should never give the impression that racism and discrimination don't exist, but they should challenge the dishonesty of those who seek to further divide the country on tenuous and embellished accusations of racism, in addition to confronting those who would distort conservatives and the conservative ideas, the policies, and the messages to indict us as racists. Moreover, I think conservatives should clarify the extent of racism's existence, and that's acknowledging that on this side of heaven, racism in some form of magnitude is always going to exist. But we should thoughtfully highlight specifically where racism exists and where it doesn't, and that involves directly challenging the premises offered by those who claim that racism is a comprehensive explanation of all that compromises Black life. Another Pew Research poll said that 88% of Blacks said the country needs to continue making changes for Blacks to have equal rights with whites. Now, the poll didn't define what equal rights are, and I think that equal rights has been redefined to mean equal outcome. An additional 42% of Blacks believe the country will eventually make the changes needed for Blacks to have equal rights with whites, while just 8% say the country has already made the necessary changes. However, 53% of whites say the country still has work to do for Blacks to achieve equal rights with whites, and only 11% express doubt that these changes will come. 40% of whites believe the country will eventually make the changes needed for Blacks to have equal rights, and about the same share, which is 38%, say enough changes have already been made. So it's obvious that Blacks and whites hold differing perspectives on racial relations. However, I think the point of agreement between both Blacks and whites is that racial polarization is getting worse and the divergence appears upon ideological lines. Now, the topic of race is obviously an overly sensitive topic. I think the rules and expectations with regard to how people are to navigate and discuss such a delicate issue continue to change, which increases the delicacy in which the topic is handled. But nevertheless, I think there's one guiding rule and one guiding assumption. The rule is that white Americans are directly or indirectly still responsible for the unrelenting presence of white supremacy and white racism, whereas the assumption is that the socioeconomic challenges and racial disparities between Blacks and whites are consequences of a robust systemic racial prejudice and discrimination. But not all white people are equally responsible for the punitive effects of racial discrimination. According to the prevailing orthodoxy of the left, sometimes implied, sometimes clearly stated, those responsible for the unrelenting racial oppression that Blacks face in the post-civil rights era are generally white conservatives, and I think white conservatives are a stand-in for white America. It's around the normative framework of Black victim, which is owed remittances for continuing grievances, and the white victimizer in debt for those grievances, that the so-called conversation and dialogues regarding race is constructed. But these so-called conversations have predictable tones of racial blame, white guilt, and Black victimization, and many conservatives have increasingly withdrawn and refused to engage the topics of race or racial discrimination. The expectation by conservatives to repeatedly endure political criticism and moral condemnation by Blacks and white progressives on behalf of Blacks concerning the Black condition, with no consideration given to the moral demands and expectations of Blacks, is uninteresting, it's unproductive, and it's exhausting. Those times when conservatives are drawn into these conversations, or when conservatives feel compelled to respond, be it to charges of racism or other, offer sincere perspectives and solutions to this colorized ordeal, the rhetoric used with respect to race is always steeped in some sort of timidities, reticence, anxiety, and fatigue. Conservatives are still learning the articulacy and nuance of racial language. And we still don't possess the familiarity that cultivates confidence when speaking about contemporary racial issues and the Black condition. And I think these problems are pretty much self-imposed. Conservatives are much too eager to embrace caution, proactively attempting to minimize offense while anticipating charges of racism and racism rather than focusing on the qualified content in need of communication. This apprehension is partially the product of conservatives recurrently assailed as racist, despite sincere efforts and usually devoid of actual evidence. And still, despite conservatives' best interests and intentions, the conversation concerning political solutions to racial disharmony and Black socioeconomic inequity, in addition to who or what is to blame, never changes. So consequently, fatigue sets in again. Now, I define racial fatigue as the weariness produced by repeatedly hearing and anticipating the unproductive racial storyline marked as the conversation on race. Now, as a parenthetical, technically, very little approaches an actual conversation or a discussion or a dialogue on racial issues because intellectually honest and constructive conversations are intentionally avoided. In reality, since the 1960s, this so-called dialogue has been politicized in an ideological lecture. It's a condescending monologue where progressives repeatedly and sanctimoniously berate the country or conservatives for its racialized past, maintaining that systemic racism, even in the 21st century, remains the all-encompassing explanation for Black difficulty, in addition to the racial disparities that exist across several socioeconomic quality of life indicators. Now, this reprimand comes at the expense of constructive dialogue and reasonable solutions, including the acknowledgement of what Blacks can and must do first to mitigate much of what constrains the quality of Black life. It's after that point, after Blacks take the initiative to control what they can control, that the country can begin to clarify and identify and attempt to alleviate the systemic issues, if and where they exist, that obstruct Black achievement, in addition to what contributes to the diminishing quality of Black life. Now, repeating the prevailing narrative of systemic Black racial victimization continually sacrifices real Black self and societal empowerment and Black development in lieu of the preservation of Black helplessness and dependency on government and white progressives. And for the left, this racism is systemic for a reason. If racism is relegated to the individual or isolated situations devoid of a pattern, the person and actions responsible for the discrimination, which are localized, can be ignored, morally marginalized, and confronted and overcome. But if racism is systemic, then discrimination is granted the powers of omnipotence and omnipresence. This victimizes all Blacks uninterruptedly, always and everywhere, while simultaneously indicting whites regardless of personal feelings of racial animus, proven racialized history, or contemporary action establishing discrimination. This scheme preserves a system of racial victims, which has literally become a virtue of helplessness. It also preserves racial oppressors, which are an embodiment and distinguishable presence of evil. Further, this scheme has built into it a form of messianism, white progressives and leftists via government, whose obligation is to remedy the effects of systemic racism, and it never remedies the effects, it just simply manages them to create further dependence, for obvious reasons. The system is dominated by the political and religious left and controlled by white guilt and white guilt by association, aspiring toward the reclamation of moral authority granted through the resolution of original sin. Theologically speaking, it's a works-based righteousness. The guilty party, here white people and white conservatives, seek absolution of racial sins committed against the aggrieved, which are Black Americans. This absolution is sought through the confession of sin of white privilege and supremacy, or at least a passing acknowledgement of it, sincerely or not, which initiates a process of removing the guilt and sin. Confession is then followed by various forms of penance, diverse forms of restitution like social policies, lower standards, economic redistribution of goods and services, to be done at the expense of the white self. Now, normally that's called initiating justice, but they call it social justice. The remission of and forgiveness of sin and attainment of righteousness is never granted, of course. Even if it were granted, it wouldn't be up to the so-called aggrieved or victimized. It would be granted by white leftists with or without black opinion. And it's for their benefit. And whites would convince blacks that it would be to their benefit. But it's really defined by white progressives as what's best for white progressives. And that is maintaining black dependence on progressive government and continued social demonization of white America, exemplified by conservatism. Further, the slander of conservatism and the dependence on systemic racism, which is impugning American culture and its corresponding values, has been offered so often and so irresponsibly and for so long that any chance of a fruitful public discussion of race in American society has become overly politicized and bears no fruit. Further still, suggesting racism at every turn has had the effect of trivializing actual incidents of racism, which prevents good people from bringing attention to it, ostracizing it, and overcoming it, which in turn creates authentic victims of real racism. Negligently and habitually blaming racism for black discomfort has reached an apex during the last 8 years. Subsequently, racial fatigue, emotional backlash, and racial resentment toward white progressives, but specifically blacks, have increased among conservatives, religious and non-religious alike. White progressives don't suffer the same negative repercussions resulting from the stigma of racial dishonesty the way that racial minorities do. But for the left, that's a necessary evil. For conservatives, we should call it just evil. This kind of identity politics, mingled with disingenuous racial agendas, exacerbates anger and frustration and encourages a justified disinterest and increased lack of sympathy, all while increasing racial discordance. So in other words, it just produces a racial fatigue. Now, consequently, I believe one of the reasons for conservative racial fatigue is the outcome of an overabundance and redundancy of hearing about race and not enough doing about race, such as soberly confronting the authentic challenges that complicate black life while actively healing the wounds that maintain racial disharmony. Moreover, the fear, reluctance, cynical disinterest, and frustration and the expectation of having the conventional racial storyline reinforced also induce racial fatigue, compelling conservatives, religious, non-religious alike, to withdraw from addressing such an important issue. The problem with the conservative fatigue-induced silence, disinterest, and absence on the matter by definition has led to inaction when dealing with racialized matters. Conservative silence and or absence needed from the nuanced conversation and action on racial matters creates a void that's inevitably been filled. When conservatives concede, it affords disingenuous people and organizations space and opportunity to reinforce the myth that conservatives are racist or don't care about their fellow citizens. But it also allows the villains the opportunity to perpetuate racial division, and this is where Black Lives Matter and recently the alt-right have come into play. Conservative silence allows real people with real problems to continue suffering. Now, take Black Lives Matter. This organization has been labeled a continuation of the civil rights movement in an ongoing effort to give the movement moral authority and religious credibility that it demonstrably lacks and doesn't deserve. This movement isn't the progeny of the civil rights movement, but the successors to the Black Power protest movement of the 1960s and early 70s, when Black activists lost patience with and interest in the civil rights movement's strategy of nonviolent resistance and its desire to integrate. Like Black Power activists, Black Lives Matter seeks a more aggressive and confrontational plan of action when dealing with mainstream America, even if it lacks a pragmatic agenda to back up its theatrical displays of racial solidarity, racial pride, and social disruption. Now, Black Lives Matter claims that Black Lives Matter. Part of demonstrating Black Lives Matter is to concentrate on structural racism. Now, as I said before, structural racism is a fluid term, which generally means black deficiency when compared to whites in numerous measures of social and economic opportunity and achievement. But are the racial disparities in the quality of life metrics by definition evidence of systemic racism? No, I argue no, because when you start to take in different variables like free will, that kind of reduces what they would call systemic racism. We can never overrule personal choice. But the over-reliance on systemic racism is an all-inclusive oversimplification of black misfortune, and it disempowers blacks. It prevents blacks from taking charge of their own situations, minimizes human agency in correcting and shaping their current realities and their destinies. Structural racism is a lazy but enchanting term to many people because it's an easy vehicle of blame by those wanting to explain why blacks suffer certain sociological issues that negatively affect their standard of living. But it's also an easy way for white progressives, mainly, and others, to feel good about themselves through the process of dissociation. And that's distancing themselves from the evil and stigma of white racism and white privilege and white supremacy, and gaining or reclaiming moral authority and moral superiority in the process. But again, it doesn't contribute anything meaningful to Black progress, because Black progress isn't the goal. Using Blacks for political benefit in combination with regaining moral authority is the goal, and that's especially for the left. But it's also an excuse. If life-altering conditions that negatively affect Blacks can be blamed on the all-power, ever-present forces of racism, thus being systemic or structural, then non-white minorities, especially Blacks, can't be individually or corporately held responsible for their actions and consequences. In other words, systemic racism is more powerful than any and all attempts to rectify problems that inhibit human flourishing. Now, again, like I said, this explanation dehumanizes Blacks, it externalizes all problems and solutions while refusing to call Blacks to a higher standard of living. When we hold Blacks to a separate and distinct standard from everybody else, that's still separate but unequal. And that's what systemic racism does. It's a very dehumanizing factor. It also says that every other race has the power and capability, whether internally or externally, to overcome their situations, but not Blacks. Now, if that's not a very, dehumanizing thing to say about Black Americans, then I don't know what is. Now, this is what Black Lives Matter focuses on, but they don't focus on things that would actually prove that Black Lives Matter. They don't talk about Black abortion rates. One pro-life organization said that 870 Black babies are killed every day. Blacks are only 13% of the population, but they have 38% of the abortions in the country. Now, all 13% of us aren't having children. Only women are. And if you take away the women who can't have children or are not childbearing age or incarcerated in any given year, you're looking at 3 or 4% of the population having more than a third of abortions. Now, these are unarmed Black lives that Black Lives Matter is not talking about, but I think conservatives should be. If you talk about Black criminality, every year 6,000 Blacks are killed by other Blacks. In any given year, Blacks are responsible for 93% of all Black homicide victims. Do these Black lives matter? Every year, 73% of Black children that are born that escape abortion are born illegitimate. Blacks have low marriage rates. Blacks are underserved by substandard education. There's a lack of economic opportunity. Addressing all of these issues as conservatives would demonstrate that Black Lives Matter in a way that would be very difficult to be labeled and charged racist, because conservatives would not just be talking, we would actually be doing. So, buy me a beer and I'll tell you exactly what I think about Black Lives Matter and all this other type of stuff. Now, due to all of this, let me get back real quick. As it relates to these problems, Black abortions, illegitimacy, and criminality, I think that the church can be instrumental in creating innovative theologies, orthodox theologies that deal with the body. And it must be communicated and emphasized to Blacks. If Blacks are Christian, and the majority of them are, then not only are they created in God's image, their identity must be established in Christ, not in their Blackness. Now, this theology must challenge the self-destructive behaviors like abortion, illegitimacy, criminality, and must take seriously the consequences that sexual irresponsibility has on the body, has on the broken family, has on the deterioration of Black society. It must painstakingly emphasize over and again the idea of loving one's neighbor and loving oneself as an obligation. Now, due to the self-inflicted traumas present in Black culture, one can argue persuasively that Blacks suffer from a lack of self-love. This is one reason Blacks try so hard to prove to others that Black lives matter, and why Blacks spend a disproportionate amount of time trying to convince the country of Black self-worth. Now, in a sad and emotionally twisted way, the Black psyche desperately and diligently desires to convince mainstream America that Blacks matter, that we're valued and worth loving. And if we can convince other people that we're worth loving, it's only then that we can begin to love ourselves. That's perverted. We love ourselves if you love us first. And they don't realize that that credibility is not shaken out with a lot of people, because we're not doing enough to prove to other people that we take ourselves seriously and that we love ourselves. A potential problem is that though blacks share a commonality of beliefs with conservative Christians, which actually makes them evangelicals, religiously or theologically defined, there's still a cultural rift that exists between blacks and white evangelicals, as many blacks still view evangelicalism as responsible for slavery, an unfulfilled Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation. And so I think that churches have to do more to heal that wound to bring us together. I'll conclude. When it comes to addressing the issues that directly affect race, we're past the point of trepidation, reluctance, disinterest, or racial fatigue. Conservative silence and virtual absence has allowed the left to fill the void, controlling the racial dialogue. Conservatives must be resolved to reject the timidity of talk and action because we risk offending the sensibilities of the emotional class. Conservatives should expose the dark motives and ignorance of the left that cultivates ongoing suffering of people who need help. If America is serious about reclaiming moral authority that's lost during slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow, it must reject the symbolic gestures of social reparations in favor of actual black development and resume the process of integration that leads to human flourishing. I truly, truly believe that integration was stopped in the late 1960s and early 70s, and I think that's one of the reasons why we still have this racial disharmony. Blacks want the benefit of being American, but not fully embracing their identity as Americans. And I think this is where the church can come in by creating referring to the New Testament theology of adoption, and integrating that into black churches. I think if we're going to do this, conservatives have an obligation, but so do the churches, and so do the theologians, and so do black people. I'm not going to let black people off the hook. I think that one of the things that's going to go a long way is blacks offering forgiveness, not necessarily holding on to the pain and grief and the anguish that was brought to us historically. And I think one very good example of that is what we saw after Charleston. Right after Charleston, you saw nothing but people in pain and anguish, but in their pain and anguish who were directly affected. They said to Dylann Roof when he was brought to court, "I'm in pain, I'm suffering, but I'm praying for your soul. I forgive you. My mother taught me not to hate anybody, but I forgive you." And the country was mesmerized by this. The media was mesmerized, but they don't understand Christianity at all. And people were coming to Charleston and praying with these people, even atheists. They were praying with these people because they didn't react like Ferguson or Baltimore. They reacted by getting on their knees and praying for one another. And the media was so shook that they changed the focus of black forgiveness to actual white racism to the Confederate flag and completely undermined a teachable moment, as Obama would say. I mean, we know that blacks can forgive, but it's not happening in the churches the way it needs to be. And it's not happening amongst conservatives. So I just say we should just overcome our timidity, overcome racial fatigue. I understand it, but the left isn't going to help blacks, but I think that we can. Thank you.